What is a war crime? What's the difference between propaganda and true misconduct that we as citizens should be concerned about? That's the subject of this episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. Welcome to another episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, retired U.S. Cavalry Colonel and former instructor at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College and prior faculty at the U.S. Army and U.S. Naval War Colleges. This series of podcasts introduces enduring lessons of war, not so much for those who study war as a profession, but for anyone who wants to fulfill their role as informed citizens in our country's deliberations about war and peace. Every time the United States or Israel use military force, there are immediate claims that those military forces are committing war crimes. I also note that such claims are never made about the opposing side, whether that's Hamas, Hizbollah, Houthis, Iran, or any other state or non-state armed group opposing Western armed forces. I also note that there are some voices that insist that any military operation is unjust and constitutes a war crime, at least if the party involved is from the West. Apart from the bias, there is the deliberate use of the term war crime, intended to be inflammatory and de-legitimize the accusing party, raising images of Nazi and Japanese atrocities in World War II. But what is a war crime? Now, as usual, the opinions in these podcasts are my own and don't necessarily represent the opinion of the Department of Defense or anyone else in the U.S. government or any other organization I am or have ever been associated with. I also want to reiterate that I am not a law of war expert, just a retired cavalry officer for whom the laws and customs of war provided the boundaries of what was allowed and what was unacceptable. As I just said, the term war crime is used as an inflammatory term to delegitimize a state or a state's armed forces. In my opinion, it's used so often that it undermines the true meaning of the term, eroding its impact and ultimately undermining the law of war. As citizens, consumers of news, and targets of propaganda, we need to understand the true meaning of this concept. In this way, we can resist propaganda, regardless of source, and demand accountability when true war crimes occur. The laws and customs of war are almost as comprehensive and complex as tax law. Fortunately, the complexity follows the famous saying attributed to 1st century BC Rabbi Hillel that the entirety of the Torah could be summed up by saying, "Do not do hateful things to others that you would not want them to do to you," and the rest is commentary. The law of war is much the same. Military forces at all levels and ranks should not make war in a way that they would not want to have done to them or to the civilians they exist to protect. To say that anyone who violated any of the laws of war committed a war crime might be technically correct, but meaningless. It's similar to saying that walking across the street against a light makes one a criminal. Examples in the law of war would be if a soldier, sleeping in his bunk, was alerted to an enemy attack and he ran out in whatever sleeping attire he had on to repel the attack. Technically, he violated the law of war by directly participating in hostilities while not wearing the uniform of his armed forces. I don't think any rational person would call him a war criminal for that. The DoD Law of War Manual has another example. If, during an international armed conflict, military medical personnel perform their duties while wearing the armlet displaying the Red Cross or other approved device affixed to their right arm, rather than to their left arm as specified in Article 40 of the First Geneva Convention, then that is a violation of the law of war. Again, it's a real stretch to consider that a war crime. Most often, then, war crimes mean serious violations of the law of war. Felonies, not misdemeanors. The Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals defined war crimes as violations of the laws and customs of war which include willful killing or murder, ill treatment or deportation to slave labor of the civilian population of occupied territory, murder or ill treatment of prisoners of war or shipwrecked persons, taking and killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property, wanton destruction of towns or villages, or other devastation not justified by military necessity. In addition to these, the 1949 Geneva Convention included acts known as grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. These additional acts include torture or inhuman treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, torture or inhuman treatment, including biological experiments, compelling a prisoner of war or civilians to serve in the forces of the hostile power, and willfully depriving a prisoner of war or civilians of the rights of a fair and regular trial. But curiously, these additional elements are not considered war crimes in and of themselves. The Department of Defense Law of War Manual states that the term grave breaches was deliberately chosen so as not to indicate that violations of those provisions of the 1949 Geneva Conventions were themselves crimes, or that the 1949 Geneva Conventions created an international penal code. That would have been up to states to implement in their own national laws, and the United States did just that. For U.S. forces, the War Crimes Act included these grave breaches as war crimes. The War Crimes Act also defined war crimes to include the following elements from the Hague Convention of War on Land: to employ poison or poisoned weapons. Perfidy. This means improper use of flags of truce, use of other national flags, enemy uniforms, or the symbols of the Red Cross to gain a military advantage. To kill or wound an enemy who has surrendered or is unable to fight. To declare no quarter. To employ weapons that cause unnecessary pain or suffering. To attack undefended towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings, and this especially includes cultural, religious, and medical establishments, provided that they are not being used at the time for military purposes. And that's it. Just because you may not like war or you think that something is unfair, unless the act is one of the items I just mentioned, it is not a war crime. Now, that doesn't mean that other violations of the laws and customs of war are not enforced. They should be, and frequently are, but the responsibility for that enforcement is the military justice system of that nation. I'll give you one fictitious example. In the TV series McHale's Navy, the crew of PT-76 has a Japanese prisoner of war who they use as a domestic servant. Now, if that happened in real life, it would have been a violation of Article 4 of the Hague Convention, but it would have been up to the U.S. Navy to investigate and take corrective action. It was not a war crime. In a real-world example, during the Battle of Britain, a German bomber became lost and accidentally dropped its bombs on London, thinking it was empty land because all the lights were out below them. When the crew landed, they were arrested and put on a train to Berlin for court-martial. However, by the time they arrived, Churchill had ordered a reprisal bombing of Berlin, and the strategic bombing of the civilian population centers by both sides began. Although the Nazi government of Germany in World War II did not believe it had to follow the Geneva Convention in its war against Russia, because Russia was not a party to the Geneva Convention, the German army would sometimes bring its soldiers to court-martial for violations of the law of war, because those laws were also reflected in the field service regulations of the German army. I want to close with a little bit about the recent spat between the White House and the Vatican. Pope Leo rightfully pointed out that any military effort to destroy the whole Iranian civilization, which would be a threat against the entire people of Iran, is completely unacceptable. Per the definition above, it would be a war crime, and more, a crime against humanity. Pope Leo went on to say that this was more than just a matter of law, but also of morality. He was completely correct in this, should the United States have done anything to act on that threat. That this threat from President Trump was histrionic hyperbole should have been apparent to anyone familiar with President Trump's rhetoric throughout his first term and this one. Whether or not he intended to act on that threat, the morality of making such a threat is worth exploring. Politicians and diplomats lie and exaggerate all the time. Some can argue that this threat brought Iran to accept the ceasefire. Others could argue that it was imprudent and eroded whatever legitimacy the United States may have had in this conflict. I think that there's a third troubling aspect. When someone makes a threat, the person to whom the threat is made might take it seriously and act on it. This is particularly true if that party perceives that the party making the threat has the capacity to carry it out and believes that they will because it's what they would do if they had that capacity. This month, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists cited open-source intelligence reports that Iran has stockpiled a variety of chemical weapons and biological weapons. If the Iranian regime truly felt it was facing the end of its civilization, it might be inclined as a sort of Götterdämmerung to use its remaining ballistic missiles and drones to preemptively launch biological and chemical agents throughout the range of those weapons. In that case, the civilization-ending rhetoric would not only have been imprudent, it would have been complicit in a wider disaster. In my opinion, the proper response to Pope Leo's understandable concern should not have been further imprudent rhetoric, but simply the classic Trump response of, "Thank you for your attention in this matter." And thank you for your attention to my matters here, and join me next time on The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare.